morning, and welcome to the Africa Weekly Talk. Today's subject on the docket is why are military coups becoming so rampant on the continent of Africa today? And unfortunately, why are most of these youth of Africa today embracing these military coups and military governments in their various African countries? It is unfortunate. After going these through military coups right after independence, where most of these military coups were orchestrated by our colonial masters and the CIA of America to overthrow our democratically elected governments and replace them with military leaders that were in sync with their ideology. And these selfish military leaders didn't know any better at the time of the colonial masters' plans for Africa. So they bought into this notion of capitalism and restoring order in their various African countries by helping them orchestrating these military coups to overthrow their democratically elected leaders of their various African countries. A case in point was Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Patrice Lumumba of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And out of these military coups that set back Africa's socio-economic development back over 50 years to 100 years. Because if you look at most military coups that took place right after independence in most African countries, Africans have to go through this military coups after military coups and so on and so forth. And an average military leader in Africa at that time pretty much stayed in power for at least about 15 to 20 years. All the way until 1990, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the USSR. That's when the Western powers, especially the United States, started selling this idea of democratically elected governments all over the world. So right around the early 1990s through the mid 1990s, you started having these electoral democracies cropping up in Africa as well as all over the world. And out of these electoral democracies also came with crony capitalism, corruption, fraudulent governments, and governments disguised as electoral democracies, but with impunity, they were operating like an autocratic form of governance towards their own fellow citizens. So basically, if you look at for the past 20, 30 years, most of these African countries haven't started these electoral democracies. And with these electoral democracies that most of these youth of Africa haven't experienced, they don't see anything better for them. All they see is corruption, crony capitalism, fraudulent governance, abuse of power by their elected leaders. So they don't know anything better. They don't know anything better. All they have been seeing now is these corrupt governments in their various African countries. No wonder these people will jump to the streets and celebrate these military coups in their various African countries because they haven't seen anything better. Because if they had seen something better, why would they celebrate autocratic form of government, military dictatorships? They will never be going to the streets celebrating, jubilating when a democratically elected government is overthrown by military leaders in their various African countries. Why would they do that? But if you haven't seen anything better, and all you have seen is poverty, corruption, abuse of power, crony capitalism, where the very few, the very elites in their various countries drain their natural resources and the wealth of their various African countries. This is what will happen. And these are the main fundamentals of why these military coups are embraced, unfortunately, by these youths of these various African countries. Because all they see is the level of corruption, greed, crony capitalism, politicians looting their resources, stealing from their country's wealth, and sharing it among their crony capitalist friends and their various families and so on and so forth. So when you have a system of governance like this, that is supposed to be democratic, that is supposed to be democracy, and the youth of these various African countries see it as a form of dictatorship disguised in the form of electoral democracies, then they will definitely embrace military coups and overthrowing of their elected democratic governments. So I can understand why these youths embrace this tyranny, embrace these military leaders. And unfortunately, it is the bad governance of these various African countries that have contributed, or basically have been the bedrock for these military coups that have occurred in Africa in the past 3 years. I mean, the past 3 years, we've had how many coups? 7 coups. 7 coups in the past 3 years in various African countries. Why? I mean, you would think in this modern world, we were moving from military governments to democratic elected governments. But when you have democratic elected governments who are operating or governing like autocratic form of governance, then that is what is going to happen. I mean, look, you said you are democratic elected government, but meanwhile, when it's time for you to cede power, and then you try to use the so-called democratic system to change the constitutions of your various African countries, I mean, what do you expect? What do you expect when you create a system of governance that is corrupt and fraudulent? What do you expect from these youth? They will definitely run into the hands of their so-called saviors, because that is all they know. All they know is corruption, abuse of power, and fraudulent form of governance. So they will run to these military leaders as their saviors. But they started with these so-called Western leaders, like countries. These Western countries that are now embracing democracy were the very countries that pretty much set Africa back 50 years or 60 years right after independence. Because they are the very countries that orchestrated the military coups that toppled our democratically elected governments right after independence. Because they were tilting towards the East or non-aligned movements. And they didn't like that form of government or economic policies and so on and so forth. So they have to topple our governments. So they were the ones which set in motion all these military coups on the continent of Africa. And today, these same Western powers are now crying foul against military coups and talking about restoring democracy and so on and so forth. But fellows, the saddest part of all of this is that when did our African leaders start to adopt this imperialistic mindset and ideology of our colonial masters and imperial masters of the past? I mean, this military coup that took place in Niger a couple of weeks ago is a very, very sad situation. I'm a staunchly against military coups. I'm a staunch believer in democratic principles and democracy, because I've always argued that the only way a country can become economically prosperous and develop is through a good democratically form of government, period. Because it's only through good governance and good democracies that will open up markets for good economic development. Because democracy and capitalism work hand in hand. To have a great capitalist system that will create prosperity for the citizens of a country, you have to have a good democratic system. It goes hand in hand. Because it's only through democracy that will free up people's ambitions. That will be a guidance for people to be able to create an environment that will create prosperity for a country and develop. And a clear case is the United States of America. And this same goes with communism and autocratic form of governance. Autocratic form of governance also go hand in hand with communism, because autocratic form of governance hampers growth and economic development. It's just like dictatorship as well as communism, where the government controls everything. So it does not embrace the idea of individualistic creativity of its fellow citizens. It hampers them and limits their ability to grow beyond what the government have asked of them. And out of that, they can never grow to become a very good economic country. So that's why it's no wonder that most communist autocratic systems are very impoverished countries, poor, and have not been able to advance to any level. We all know the test case of communism, why it didn't work and why communism failed miserably right around 1990 with the crashing of the Soviet Union, the USSR. So we know all of that. So I'm a staunch believer of a democratic system of governance, because that is the only way Africa can become economically independent. So I don't believe in military coups. I don't believe in any form of government that is imposed on the people by military government leaders and so on and so forth. But the question is, how did it get to this point? 7 military coups in 3 years. And it all started because of the so-called electoral democracies that we have in our various African countries that are pretty much in disguise, because they are not real democracies. They are crony capitalist systems. They are autocratic systems disguised in electoral democracies. And these youth and these citizens of these various African countries have come to believe that. So they don't have any trust in these governments. So no wonder they will run to these military governments as their saviors. Because if they have seen anything better, there's no way they will embrace these military governments. No way. I mean, look at a clear case, for instance, is like the United States of America or any European country. Do you think the citizens of America or Europe will embrace military coup in their various countries? Heck no. Why would they embrace tyranny? Why would they embrace dictatorship when all they have seen in their lives is freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, and ability to develop their countries and create a prosperity and economic wealth in their countries? They will never run to no dictatorships or military leaders. No. Because if there's something wrong with their system, they also understand the fundamentals of a democratic system is to go and elect the leaders that you believe will create prosperity and give you the political freedom and security that you need in your various countries. They are not going to run to no military leaders. They will fight tyranny, period. Americans will rise up and fight tyranny if it rises in this country. And the military leaders in America know that. It's not going to happen. But that's not the same case with most African countries, because the governments are corrupt, they are fraudulent, they practice crony capitalism, where they steal the resources of their various African countries to benefit themselves and their cronies and politicians. So when you live in a country where all you see is government and politicians and the elite class in your society looting the resources of the very country resources that they're supposed to use to help build and develop your country, then you embrace military coups. So last week, you had these ECOWAS leaders having an emergency meeting in Abuja, Nigeria. And they came up with this ultimatum to the military coup leaders of Niger, that they either cede power back to the democratically elected government, or they're going to use military force to reinstate the democratically elected government of Niger. Fellas, it is sad. It is sad, and I'm very disappointed when I hear these same imperialistic ideologies coming from countries that basically have to go through this imperial powers use of the word of use of force to justify their occupation of Africa and sovereign countries in the name of restoring law and order and bringing democracies. I mean, we have a case that happened in what, 1991-92 with Siad Barre of Somalia, when George H. Bush went to Somalia. And we all know what happened afterwards. I bet you guys have heard of the watch or seen the Black Hawk Down. And look at Somalia today. Somalia today is what? It's a mess. I mean, look at Somalia. It's a failed state. And it came about because of that. Then come Iraq. What happened? Look at Iraq today. Look at Libya today. So, I mean, and currently as I'm speaking, look at Saudi Arabia and Yemen. With all their billions and billions of dollars that they have poured into Yemen, trying to defeat the Houthis in Yemen. Now look at them. They are back down in Yemen. Small country Yemen. They cannot even bring law and order in Yemen today. Because occupation doesn't work. Imperialist mindset of occupying another country in the name of democracy doesn't work. It has never worked, and it will never work. Because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're sowing the seeds for Islamic jihadist groups as well as tribalism to crop up, which most of these military leaders know about. And they will use this to fight against all these forces that are going to come into their various African countries. So if you're going to have African leaders talking about going to Niger, to invade Niger, to restore democracy, fellas, let's not buy into that nonsense. We already have test case scenarios, and this thing hasn't worked, and it will never work. What this thing is going to create is going to create serious problems for all of West Africa. Because at the end of the day, these jihadist groups are going to take advantage of the situation in Niger, and they're going to use that, and it's going to spread like a bonfire all across West Africa. So if you guys in other various West African countries, if you are not going to protest and be staunchly against this idea of going into Yemen with a West African force, then be ready for it, because it's coming. Because these jihadist groups are going to use these as the reason why they're going to start sowing seeds in all of these West African countries. I mean, fellas, I understand these West African leaders are trying to find a solution to this problem, but also we have to face the fellas. This is not about them trying to find solution to the problem in Niger. This is about them themselves using this system to protect their own governments in their various African countries in West Africa. That is what this is all about. Because they understand that their governments are corrupt, they are full of fraudulent deals and crony capitalism and so on and so forth. And they know that because they're trying to do everything to prevent these same military coups on their shores, so by forming these military alliances to protect themselves, they are forming these military alliances to protect their own governments. This is not about bringing democracy to Niger. After all, Niger is a sovereign country, fellas. It is not up to any country to go into another country in the name of bringing democracy. We've heard this music before, and it hasn't worked. And it is not going to work. It saddens me that we as Africans, sometimes I don't even know what kind of leadership that we elect. Because this decision of giving an ultimatum to the people of Niger, the military leaders of Niger, was not made out of reason. This was like an emotional decision, and just send out press release that we are giving them an ultimatum, and if they don't relinquish power and return the previous government back into office, we are going to invade Niger. Fellows, it doesn't work like that. And it's not going to work. And this is the boneheaded decision by these so-called African leaders. This tells you exactly the kind of leaders we have been electing in Africa. Because if you have smart, intelligent leaders, they would have thought through this. They would have thought through this thing before they made that decision. Because right now, let me ask you fellows. Now the military leaders of Niger are not going to back down. They are ready for this. So if you are not able to follow up with that your red line, you look weak now. And if you do, now you are going to create serious situation in Niger right now. The probability of a civil war that will break loose and go all across West Africa is very, very high with this situation. So now you have put yourself in a position where you cannot back down and you cannot also follow up with your ultimatum. You see, that was a boneheaded decision that was made by these leaders without thinking through it. Without thinking through it, because we've heard this music before. We've heard it before, and it has never worked. And it's very, very unfortunate that today we have leaders of Africa following the footsteps of our imperial colonial masters to justify why they have to invade another country. I'm sorry, fellows. We have to stand up against this imperialistic mindset. Because at the end of the day, this is about Africa. This is about security in Africa. And if you do this, this is going to create something that we would have never seen in West Africa for a long, long, long time. And it's going to happen. As much as I'm a staunch believer in democracy, as much as I'm a staunch believer in democratic form of governance, I'm also staunchly against when countries invade another country in the name of bringing democracy, because the music is being heard before. Iraq, it never worked. Saudi Arabia is not working for them in Yemen. Somalia, it didn't work. What makes us think that it's going to work in Niger? Fellows, let's think through this. There's no ego about this. Forget about your egos. Withdraw that statement of ultimatum and work to have a peaceful resolution to this situation in Niger. That's the best route for all of Africa. If it's Sunday, it's the Africa Weekly Talk. God bless you guys and peace and love.